Good morning, my dear students of grade 8. I hope you all are fine. So, today we are going to take a lecture of biology. I am your teacher Aruj Tariq, and our course is Cambridge Checkpoint Science 8. So, as you all know that we are at our last chapter, and inshallah we will finish our course soon. So, for today our topic is menstrual cycle, or you may know it as menstruation, menses, or periods. So, before starting the lecture, let me just remind you some things. You know that what is fertilization? I have told you in the previous lecture that when the sperm cell nucleus and the egg cell nucleus they fuse together, they form a new cell which is called zygote. Okay. So, when an egg cell is produced, it has two fates. There are two possibilities. Number one, maybe the egg cell is fertilized. And number two, maybe the egg cell is not fertilized. So in this topic, we will study that what happens to the egg cell. Okay, so our topic number one, we will study that or possibility number one, that what happens if the egg cell is fertilized. Okay, so if the egg cell meets with the sperm cell in the oviduct, the zygote is formed. It is same as fertilization. Okay, when egg cell and sperm cell they fuse together, they form a new cell which is called zygote, and this process is called fertilization. Let me show you. Okay, let me erase all. Okay, at number one, you can see that an egg cell leaves the ovary. This is an egg cell and it is leaving the ovary. Okay, when it leaves the ovary, you know that this is oviduct, right? So inside the oviduct, the egg cell and the sperm cell they fuse together and they form a zygote, right? Number 1 point, egg cell leaves the nucleus. This process is called ovulation, right? One egg cell leaves the ovary every month. This process is called ovulation. Number 2, the egg cell is fertilized in the ovary duct. The cell is now called a zygote. And after fertilization, a zygote is formed, and this process is called conception. Okay, now see here, if the egg cell meets with the sperm cell in the oviduct, zygote is formed. Okay, the moment at which zygote is formed, it is called conception. Okay, and conception is the start of a new life. How? Because first the woman will conceive, then she will become pregnant, and then she will give birth to a new baby. So conception is the start of a new life. Then it takes several days for a zygote to become an embryo and to travel into the uterus. Okay, now let me show you that in the third point, you can see that the zygote divide to make a little ball of cells. This is called embryo, and then this embryo travels into the uterus. Okay, you all know that this is your uterus. Okay, so it takes several days for a zygote to become an embryo. What happens? That zygote takes several days and divide and divide and divide. It forms a ball of cells, and then this ball of cells is called embryo, and then this embryo travels into the uterus. Now When the embryo has sunk into the wall of the uterus, the woman is pregnant. So there is a difference between conception and pregnancy. Here, second point, this is called conception, when a zygote is formed. And this fourth point, this is called pregnancy. Okay, the moment pregnancy. Okay, so the embryo enters the uterus lining and starts to develop into fetus, and then fetus will become the baby in 9 months, and then the woman will give birth to a new baby. So the first point is called ovulation, the second point is conception, when a zygote is formed, third point is the conversion of zygote into embryo, and the fourth point is the when the embryo sunk into the wall of the uterus. We call it pregnancy, or we call it that the woman is pregnant. It takes about 9 months for an embryo to become a fetus and then the baby. So I will revise this. If the egg cell meet with the sperm cell in the oviduct, a zygote is formed. Okay, and this is called conception. And conception is the start of new life. And it takes several days for a zygote to become an embryo and to travel into the uterus. And when the embryo has sunk into the wall of uterus, the woman is pregnant. And it takes about 9 months for an embryo to become a fetus and then the baby. And this diagram is showing you that what happens if the cell is fertilized. So in this process, number 1, ovulation happens. Egg cell leaves the ovary. Okay, what is ovulation? One egg cell is released from ovary each month. This process is called ovulation. And the number 2 point, the egg cell is fertilized in the oviduct, because fertilization happens in oviduct, and this cell is now called a zygote. And this point we call it conception, the moment at which zygote is formed. Then the zygote divides to make a little ball of cells, and this ball of cells is called embryo. And then this embryo goes into the lining of uterus and is implanted there. This process is called pregnancy. Okay, so now I hope you know the difference between conception and pregnancy, and it takes 9 months for the embryo to become fetus, and then fetus will become the baby. Okay, I wanted to show you a picture here. This is the stages of pregnancy, fetal development. This is the embryo at 3 weeks, then 4 weeks, then 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks and 12 weeks. In the 12 weeks, you can see that now this embryo has become a proper human being. So I hope now you know that what happens if the egg cell is fertilized. Simply, if the egg cell is fertilized, a woman will become pregnant and she will give birth to a new baby. Now, the second possibility. If the egg cell is produced but it is not fertilized, then what will happen? Because every month one egg cell leaves the ovary. So what happens if the egg cell is not fertilized? Okay, so now we are going to discuss that what happens if the egg cell is not fertilized. In the first possibility, we have seen that what happens if the egg cell is fertilized. Now we will see that what happens if the egg cell is not fertilized. Okay. So, when the egg cell is not fertilized, a process happens, and that process is called menstrual cycle. People also call it menstruation, menses or periods. Okay, and this happens every month. That's why it is called a cycle, because it repeats every month. So while we will study this topic, menstrual cycle, you will know that what happens if the egg cell is not fertilized. So we are going to study the menstrual cycle in 4 steps. Number 1, development of egg cell. Number 2, release of egg cell. Number 3, egg cell doesn't fertilize. And number 4, breaking of uterus lining. Okay, we will discuss this diagram with every step. Okay, now step number 1 is development of egg. Okay, many egg cells are not fertilized, right? They just carry on traveling along the oviduct and they eventually die. So this is our answer to the question that what happens if the egg cell is not fertilized. So if the egg cell is not fertilized, it eventually die. Okay. On average, one egg cell is released from ovary each month, and this process is called ovulation. Now look at this diagram. You can see that number 1 step, egg cell develops in an ovary. So development of egg cell, and the lining of the uterus starts to become thick. This is our uterus. Okay, and this red one is showing you the lining of uterus. So you can see that the lining of the uterus starts to grow thicker. So this is our step number 1, in which the lining of uterus starts to grow thicker. And in this picture you can see that here it's the start. Okay, here ovulation happens. Okay, egg cell is released and the uterus lining starts to get thicker, right? Now we will go toward the step number 2, that is the release of egg cell. So the uterus has to get ready just in case the egg is fertilized. Okay, so what will happen, that egg cell will go from the ovary into the oviduct and it will wait for the sperm cell. If the sperm cell will come, the egg is fertilized and it will form a zygote. Zygote will become an embryo and embryo will be implanted in the uterus. But if the fertilization happens, the uterus has to be ready. Okay, so what happens, that the lining of the uterus becomes thick and spongy, ready to receive the embryo, and this process happens every month. Okay, so what happens in the step number 2, that the lining of the uterus becomes thick and spongy, ready to receive the embryo. Okay, and the egg cell is in the oviduct where it is waiting to be fertilized. Okay, here step number 2, the release of egg cell. The egg cell is released from the ovary and the lining of uterus becomes more thick. You can see that it has become more thick and more spongy with the passage of time. Here you can see that egg cell is released from the egg cell, and now it will go into the oviduct where it will wait for the sperm to come and fertilize the egg. So the uterus lining is thick and spongy and is waiting for the embryo. And here in this picture you can see that the lining of the uterus becomes more thick and more spongy, right? Now we will go toward our step number 4, that is when egg cell doesn't fertilize. Okay, here step number 3, if the egg cell is not fertilized, what happens, the thick lining of uterus is not needed. Why? Because if there is no fertilization, there will be no zygote, no embryo to be implanted in the uterus. So if there is no embryo, the thick lining is not needed. Okay. Here the egg cell was not fertilized, so it just travels into the uterus. Okay, it just travels into the uterus and eventually dies. Okay, so what is the step number 4? The egg cell is not fertilized and it eventually dies. Okay, in the step number 4, the death of egg cell happens. Okay, in this picture you can see that this is the phase, okay, where the egg cell is not fertilized. Okay, and now this thick lining of the uterus is not needed. Now we will go toward our step number 4, that is breaking of uterus lining. Now egg cell is not fertilized, egg cell is dead, so we don't need the uterus lining anymore. So what will happen? In the step number 4, the thick lining of uterus break down. Okay, the uterus lining break down and is lost through vagina. Okay, and in adult women, this process takes about 5 days and happens once in a month. Okay, so thick lining of uterus break down and is lost through vagina. That's why you get blood from your vagina every month. And this process is called menstruation. Okay. Let me explain this with the help of this diagram. Look, the thick spongy layer of the uterus break down, okay, and it's lost through vagina. This is vagina and this is uterus. You can see that the lining has break down and it will come out in the form of blood. Now in the earlier diagram, now you will see that here, okay, here you can see that there is some blood that you can see here. Okay, you can see the uterus lining is breaking down and it is releasing the blood. So what will happen in the step number 4? That when the egg cell is not fertilized, the uterus lining is not needed. So it will break down and it will come out of your body through the vagina in the form of blood and sometimes lumps of the blood. So now you know why you get periods or menses every month, because your body gets ready for pregnancy. But if you doesn't get pregnant, the uterus lining break down and it causes the menstruation. So now what is menstruation? The loss of uterus lining through the vagina is called menstruation or period. And what is menstrual cycle? The monthly pattern of thickening and loss of uterus is called menstrual cycle. Why cycle? Because it repeats every month. Okay, so there is a difference between menstruation and menstrual cycle. Menstruation is a process in which the uterus lining is breakdown, and this process happens every month. That's why we call it menstrual cycle. Okay, so the summary of this lesson is that every month or so, the uterus lining gets thicker to prepare for the fertilized egg if the woman becomes pregnant. But if the egg doesn't get fertilized, that lining is released from the body as blood through the vagina, and this monthly process is called menstruation or period. So I hope that this topic is clear. And if you have any questions, you can ask me, and best of luck.